Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is a pro-revenge story. I was pushing 55, and after over 2 decades in the legal game, I'd learned more than my fair share of tough lessons. But one of the most critical bits of wisdom was imparted to me by a seasoned lawyer I worked under during my law school summer internship. A good attorney has 3 priorities, he told me. First, watching your own back. Second, upholding the court's integrity. And last of all, keeping the client happy. Always put yourself first, because at the end of the day, clients will stab you in the back without a second thought. The rationale? Clients will duck you over, he bluntly stated. They'll throw you under the bus in a heartbeat. I probably should have stuck with that guy, but youth and arrogance led me to greener downtown pastures. Thankfully, I never forgot that advice, and it came in mighty handy years later when a real slime ball tried to make me the fall guy. My client was this mid-sized conglomerate that had its fingers in various pies, owning properties here and there. Not a Wall Street heavyweight, but they had a sizable real estate portfolio. One fateful day, one of their buildings went up in flames. The company was keen to cash in on the insurance payout, so they tasked Frank, a grizzled corporate veteran, with handling it. Frank was closing in on 65 and thought he was hot stuff. He didn't need my legal expertise for the insurance claim, or so he claimed. He was on top of it all. Besides, lawyers charge an arm and a leg. Some dudes get their kicks from dodging legal fees, and Frank relished every penny he managed to avoid paying us lawyers. I crossed paths with him often, and he always nickeled and dimed me something fierce. That insurer is going to screw you over, I warned Frank. Pure chance had even alerted me to the fire and the resulting damages because Frank never looped me in. He'd simply let it slip during one of our interactions. From then on, I stayed on his case, desperately trying to knock some sense into his thick skull. I practically had to wrestle him to send over the proof of loss forms just to make sure he didn't bungle that up. Frank screwed up constantly, and I often pondered how he still had a job. But at least the proof of loss seemed okay. One less catastrophe to worry about. You don't know that, he dismissively retorted. I could tell he simply wanted me off the line. I get paid to sniff out when insurers are trying to shaft my clients, I fired back, and they're setting you up for a world of hurt. They've been jerking you around for ages with endless requests, paperwork, and red tape, but they have zero intention of paying out, not unless you take legal action. But Frank insisted he knew what he was doing, that everything was under control, and that he and the claims adjuster were 2 peas in a pod. The statute of limitations expires in a fortnight, I stressed. Once that window slams shut, it'll be too late to sue. The second that deadline passes, they'll stop taking your calls. You'll get a curt email saying, "Tough luck, you're SOL," and that'll be that. Don't leave this for the last minute. Let me file suit right now, and you'll have that money lickety-split. Frank was all, "Yeah, sure, whatever, quit bugging me, I got this," before hanging up as fast as humanly possible. I duly sent him the usual email detailing clear warnings and recommendations, which he promptly ignored. I resent that email repeatedly as the limitations period ticked closer, including a final one a couple days out stating, "I'll be tied up in court so you won't be able to reach me, but you have to file suit. You've got other firms on retainer, so pick one and litigate." Shockingly, he couldn't be bothered to respond, and off to trial I went. That case dragged on for a couple of weeks, and not a peep from Frank. Then, a month elapsed, followed by another, still crickets. I figured he must have resolved everything. Maybe old Frankie finally got it right, I mused to myself. Then my phone rang. Speak of the devil, it was Frank himself. Remember that whole fire insurance fiasco we discussed? We'd only gone over it a dozen times, so no, I didn't recall a single detail. I assumed he was calling to gloat, so I cut right to it. "So they covered the claim in full, eh? Way to go, buddy. Told you knew what you were doing." He asked what the hell I was rambling about, and if he could get a copy of the claim filing. "What claim?" I said, utterly baffled. "You know, the claim against the insurance company. That claim," he reiterated gruffly. "Wait, so they didn't pay out?" He abruptly hung up on me, and a few minutes later, an email from Frank popped into my inbox. He dredged up how we'd spoken before. He claimed he'd instructed me to sue, and he was worried when I never sent the filing paperwork, hence he was following up for a copy. I quickly fired back, "I'll take it the insurer refused to cover you, just like I explicitly warned, and now that the windows slammed shut, they basically told you to kick rocks, leaving you with a multi-million-dollar loss?" I definitely screwed up by not going over Frank's balding head when he disregarded me, but had I done that, he'd have blacklisted me from all future cases. That was then, this is now. So I CC'd his boss, the boss's boss, and Bill, the company's in-house counsel. Bill promptly replied all and rang me up later that afternoon. "Frank royally crapped the bed on this one," he sighed. "We know that already. He's a dolt. So what's our play here?" Let me guess, his excuses didn't pan out. Not a chance. Bill explained they'd hauled Frank into the boardroom, but his tale wasn't adding up once they factored in all my documented warnings. Plus, it made zero sense for him to keep hounding the insurer if he'd supposedly instructed me to pursue legal action. Once it transferred to counsel, Frank's hands were tied. The company knew he was peddling pure BS. So that's just it then, Bill groaned. We're out a couple $1,000,000 just like that. Not so fast, I reassured him, explaining how I'd beaten Frank to the punch. Once I realized he'd inevitably screw the pooch, I went ahead and filed a preemptive claim against the insurer. Since I'd made the idiot send me the proof of loss way earlier, I had just enough info to lodge a suit preserving the cause of action. Not an ironclad case by any means and scant on details, but it'd do the trick. You sued without our go-ahead? Bill gasped. Attorneys can't just initiate litigation without a client's consent, or else we're on the hook for whatever costs the opposition incurs. It's a huge no-no to go rogue like that. You know it, I replied nonchalantly, pulling up the claim filing and zapping it his way as we spoke. It's a tad bare bones, I admitted, but we can amend it with more meat on the bones. Thanks be to God, Bill exclaimed. I'll leave it to you then? But of course, that insurer was sitting smack dab in the crosshairs, and I knew extracting a payout would be child's play. A few days later, I got a call from some other company rep I rarely dealt with. Evidently, they had a situation requiring my expertise. I usually just handle things with Frank, I told the guy. What's the sitch? Here's what was up. They'd summoned Frank for another closed-door meeting, handed him a curt one-page termination letter, had him box up his desk knickknacks, and security frog-marched his ass right past his stunned co-workers down to the parking lot. Bye-bye, Frankie boy. At his decrepit age, decent employment prospects were basically nil. For him, it was an utterly life-altering event, but for me, just another cautionary tale I regale to greenhorn associates over beers, maybe a tad too frequently, as these days I'm the crotchety old-timer. Now, I wasn't gunning for revenge on Frank or anything. I would have felt a twinge of sympathy for the poor bastard if he hadn't blatantly tried to throw me under the bus. But the new guy who replaced him was a real straight shooter and never pulled that nickel and dime nonsense, so it all worked out swimmingly in the end. As for pursuing legal action against the insurer, that went off without a hitch. Those corporate weasels folded like a cheap suit once I amended the original filing with more substantive evidence. Within a couple of months, we had the multi-million-dollar payout couriered right to the client's doorstep. My stellar legal prowess shone through once again. I could have sat there idly while that idiot Frank flushed his client's interest down the toilet, but that simply wasn't an option. Not on my watch. Some folks might view my preemptive litigation as overstepping bounds, but I call it zealously protecting my client's rights. Sue me. I take that ethical obligation seriously. Admittedly, I didn't shed any tears when Frank's disloyalty finally caught up to him. Guys like that give our profession a bad rap. The sleazeballs who only look out for number one, scruples be damned. Good riddance, I say. That company deserved better legal counsel than some cost-cutting yes-man solely concerned with padding his own pockets. So yeah, replacing that relic Frank with someone younger, hungrier, and amenable to utilizing experienced legal expertise? Best decision that corporation's made in years. Just had to weed out the poisonous deadweight first. Not my proudest moment professionally, but frankly, the ends justified the means. The next one is an entitled people story. I've lived in my cozy little house for over 20 years now. It's nothing too fancy, just a simple 2-bedroom place with a decent-sized backyard that I've turned into my own personal sanctuary. Ever since I moved in, I've worked tirelessly on transforming that backyard into a lush, vibrant garden. It's my pride and joy, filled with flowers, vegetables, fruit trees, you name it, I've probably grown it back there. That garden is more than just a hobby for me. It's my happy place, where I can escape from the chaos of the world and find serenity among the plants and soil. I'd spend hours out there tending to everything, making sure each section was thriving, watching seeds transform into seedlings, then mature plants yielding bountiful harvests brought me so much joy. So you can imagine how horrified I was when I peered out my back window one sunny morning to see a bulldozer plowing through my beloved garden. I rushed outside in my pajamas, yelling for them to stop, only to be confronted by my new neighbor Mike. He'd moved in a few weeks ago, but barely acknowledged my friendly attempts to introduce myself. "What in blazes are you doing?" I shouted at Mike over the roar of the bulldozer. He crossed his arms defiantly. "I'm fixing up my backyard. What's it look like? Your messy garden was spilling over onto my property, so I'm getting rid of it." I was flabbergasted. "Messy? That's my garden you're demolishing, and it was not encroaching onto your land," Mike waved dismissively. "Doesn't matter now, it'll be gone soon anyway. I've got big plans to put in a pool and outdoor kitchen back here." Your weeds were in the way. Now I was seeing red. I'd offered to give Mike fresh vegetables many times since he moved in, but he always sneered that he didn't want my dirty hippie food. I took great offense to him insulting the garden I had poured my heart and soul into for over 2 decades. I don't care what plans you have, you can't just destroy my private property. I'm calling the police, I declared, pulling out my phone. Mike's defiant facade finally cracked a little. He tried to justify his actions, saying he thought some of my garden encroached just over the property line, but the damage was already done. Nearly half my garden was wrecked by the time the police arrived and ordered Mike to stop. In the aftermath, I was completely devastated. It felt like losing a dear friend. So much of my blood, sweat, and tears had gone into that garden, and now it was decimated. I met with a lawyer to discuss my options for holding Mike accountable. We filed a lawsuit against him for unlawful destruction of private property and emotional damages. The case moved swiftly through the courts. Multiple neighbors testified on my behalf, sharing how they'd seen my garden thrive for years and that it never crossed onto Mike's land. Their accounts, along with the police report and photographs of the destruction, formed a solid case against my entitled neighbor. Mike tried to counter by claiming it was an honest mistake, but the judge didn't buy it. In the end, the court ordered Mike to fully compensate me for restoration costs, as well as additional damages for emotional trauma. The first thing I did was hire a landscaping company to help rehabilitate the ruined sections of my garden. They cleared away the mess left behind and prepared the soil for replanting. Although the process was long, I found it therapeutic to gently place each new seedling and nurture them as they established roots. Seeing fresh blooms and sprouts emerge helped repair some of the heartbreak, filling me with hope. There were a few plants that couldn't be replaced, generations-old trees and rare perennials destroyed in minutes by Mike's reckless behavior, but the new growth still carried the spirit of my garden, back from the brink. With my lawyer's help, I compiled all the receipts and invoices for the restoration. The total costs came to over $15,000, which Mike was court-ordered to pay from his own pocket. His destroyed pool and outdoor kitchen plans would just have to wait. Part of me felt a tinge of pity seeing Mike's crestfallen face when the judge announced his punishment. Destroying something you love tends to invite karma. But any sympathy faded when I glanced out my window and spotted a tiny green sprout peeking through the soil. My garden would recover in time, nourished by care and patience. As for Mike, perhaps losing a chunk of money would teach him not to disregard his neighbor's passion so callously. The court's ruling sent a clear warning that his entitled behavior would no longer fly. Now, months later, my garden has transformed back into the oasis I remember. Mike keeps his head down whenever we cross paths, clearly having learned his lesson. Occasionally, I'll have a basket of fresh vegetables delivered to his doorstep. He may have destroyed my garden partially, but nothing can truly uproot it from my heart. The blossoming renewal stands as a testament to that. The next one is a petty revenge story. My fiancé and I owned a home near the downtown area where houses are close together and parking spaces at a premium. As one of the older homes in the neighborhood, ours was one of the few that had a full private driveway. Most homes had a mutual drive or none at all. The house next door was owned by a creep of a slumlord, so you can imagine the kinds of tenants he attracted. After yet another midnight move out, that house was full of garbage and leave-behinds, and he had to clear out the trash to rent it out again. He decided that between the houses, he owned 2, we owned 4, and we had a small sidewalk to access our backyard, was a great place to store the crap. The garbage pile was about 4 high, spilling onto our side and blocking our gate. After sitting for days, the garbage started attracting rodents, so we filed complaints with the municipality. After several days of no action, my fiancé shoveled all the garbage back into the neighbor's house through a basement window that had been left unlatched. A few days later, we came home from work and discovered the garbage pile back outside, exactly where it had been dumped before, and filed yet another complaint with the city. Roll forward a few days, and we arrive home to discover that the slumlord had returned to do more cleanup. We didn't see him, but knew he was there because he parked his piece of crap van in our driveway. We boxed him in so he couldn't drive off. Eventually, he knocked on the door asking us to move our vehicles. My fiancé gave him a choice: pack up all the junk in his van and take it away, or we'd be calling the city to serve him his bylaw fines and calling the police to trespass him. Guess what option he picked? The next one is a malicious compliance story. A few years back, I was the IT contracts and supplier manager at a large company, been there 25 plus years and had a lot of corporate knowledge, having worked in multiple roles over that time. Also was very well paid due to length of tenure and experience at the company. A new a-hole boss gets hired and proceeds to get rid of people he doesn't like and hires his buddies into various roles. The workplace culture took a nosedive pretty quickly. I knew my time was limited as I wasn't in his inner circle. Seeing the writing on the wall, I started looking for and applying for other roles. The a-hole boss gets me in their sights and decides to get rid of me, looking to move one of his recently hired buddies to my specialized role. He doesn't even understand what I do, needing a lot of technical knowledge combined with contract and legal. He tells me he wants to move me onto an upcoming project and to finish off what I am currently working on and not take on any new work. Through all my contacts across the company, I knew there was no new project or even significant budget for one, but I'll do what I'm told. I wrap up my work and tell him I'm ready for the project. He says, "Sit tight, it's not far away, and I don't start anything else." So I sit at my desk, applying for other jobs and waiting. One of the jobs I applied for comes through and get an offer on a Friday morning. That same afternoon, the a-hole boss comes around and says, "The project isn't happening, and as you have nothing else on your plate, we will have to let you go. Yahtzee, I know there is heaps of work backed up, and the crap is going to hit the fan soon when contracts aren't renewed, services canceled, etc. I also know my employment contract, and they will have to pay a generous redundancy, because the boss told HR my role isn't required anymore." I say, "Okay, I guess you will have to pay me a redundancy too?" "Sure," he says, not knowing what he has agreed to. So I go through the redundancy process and at the same time accept the offer of the new job. Come my last day, I happily accept the $200K payout. His face goes pale when he hears of the amount because it comes out of the team's budget. Walk out the door and into the new job the day after. Love my new job. Less stress. Great culture. A great team. Wish I'd left earlier, but then I wouldn't have got the payout if I resigned. 4 weeks later, I hear the crap is hitting the fan and they advertise for a new person for my old role as no one knows what to do because apparently my job was easy. He didn't even ask me document what I did to hand over to anyone else. The next one is an entitled people story. This happened 3 years ago, I think. Back then, I was still working in a brewery as a brewer. What a surprise, I know. At that day, one of the trainees was working in the brew house for the first time alone. An hour before I could clock off, he came to me and asked if I could help him. So we went to the mash mill, the mill that will crush the malt into flour, and he told me it wasn't working anymore. We started the mill, and after a few seconds, malt started pouring out of the top part of the mill. I then climbed up the wobbly ladder we had and started checking the small bin on top of the mill. Now the thing was, the mill is nearly 100 years old, so we had to work carefully. So while I was digging around in the malt, because I thought there was a plug in the bin, the trainee started screwing open the mill. The ladder was about 6 meters tall, so we both had to yell in order to communicate, and suddenly the door flies open, and one of the tour guides walked in with a few guests she was showing around. The trainee and I were still working and yelling, and suddenly this dumb idiot comes over to us and demands that we stop our work because she's doing a tour right now. I was still on top of a wobbly ladder and should be already home, so I was quite pissed. I yelled back at her to shut up. Repairing the mill is more important than showing around a bunch of tourists that are only here to get wasted. Funnily enough, a few months prior to that, we had a meeting with the big boss. At that meeting, the boss gave everyone who worked in production the authority to expel the guides and their tours from rooms in the brewery should they interfere with our work in some way, something the guides knew. So, I told the guide to immediately leave the malt room, which she did with an angry glare. The trainee and I then managed to fix the mill, and I went home. The next day, I was ordered to the boss's office. He told me that the guide complained about me for being rude and unnecessarily expelling her from the malt room. I then admitted that I may have been harsh, but I was solder deep in malt on top of a ladder over time. Please forgive me for not being in the best mood. I then explained what exactly happened yesterday and that the trainee can confirm my story. The boss then apologized for suspecting me and sent me off. The tour guide got a really stern talk and a formal warning. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.